So this is going to be rocket fast. So I was asked to talk about the solar disclosure notice, which is the disclosure that is given out on residential property, improved property. And first of all, I want to back up and say, why is that relevant to a bunch of brokers? Here's why. Number one, brokers are responsible for
Everything.
the acts of their agents. Okay, then I usually have some smart agents that say, well, hold on, the seller's disclosure notice is the disclosure of the seller and not of their agent. And that is the case law that's out there, that is true. The problem is, the fact pattern is going to be that you were walking through, or your agent was walking through the house as your client was filling out the seller's disclosure notice, and you tripped on the crack in the kitchen tile, and you catch yourself on the wall with your palm, and when you pull your palm back, there's fresh paint on your palm, and you notice that the client is not marking anything relating to settlement. You might even bring that up, and the client says, well, let's just, I don't think so, it's not good. I'm just not gonna mark that, no. I usually at this point have somebody say, well, that's right, I shouldn't advise them to mark that because we have a fiduciary duty to our client. What does that mean? That means I have a duty to get the highest and best price for the property. You see where that's going? So in other words, now the agent is in a conspiracy, and that's usually the claim that is filed in the lawsuit. The agent is in a conspiracy with the seller to hide known defects in the property. And it's not a case where the agent gets to say, well, I have blinders on that day and I didn't notice any of this, because what are real estate agents? You're all experts in this industry. So if you have a client that is telling you, let's just not disclose any of these relevant things, then really your duty, your best fiduciary duty to that client is telling them you need to find a different agent. I'm not going to participate in fraud. So that's usually how brokers are brought into this, is through the actions of the agents. So now, you might want to go back even farther. Back in 1993, the Texas legislature passed a statute, and it's 5008 of the Texas Property Code. And that is the seller's disclosure notice statute. It's a promulgated, in other words, that form is set up by the Texas legislature. They amend it from time to time. The paragraph for the amendments here on this page is this long. That's how many times they've amended it. The idea was that there was so much, arguably, fraud in the industry that they wanted to come up with a seller's disclosure notice so that buyers would have something to look at when they were considering whether to buy the property. Unfortunately, that seller's disclosure notice has become Exhibit 1 on all these real estate fraud cases. It is without even thinking hard, in every case I've had, whether I'm defending or I'm chasing somebody, this is seller's disclosure notice. And the reason is there's just so many ways to violate this because there's so many questions. And at this point I can just rattle on. So then we come up with the case law on the residential contract. And what do we know about that contract? It's a
Buyer's contract.
It's an as-is contract, which means you're buying the property as is with all faults known or unknown. But unfortunately, there was this case that came out about 1996 called Prudential. And what the Prudential said was, if the seller has information that they failed to disclose to a buyer, and it's not the type of information that the buyer could have uncovered through the course of ordinary diligence, then that's how you get around the as-is provision of the contract. And once you get around the as-is provision of the contract, that just means the world, I mean, it could be anything at that point. Any argument that you would have, potentially the seller would be liable. Yes, sir?
Is there a time frame? Do you have to do that from the time you close? Because had one where they had a remodel and all of a sudden there's all kinds of mold in it. But it's been a couple, 3 years.
Yeah, that's a long answer. The best claim from a plaintiff standpoint is under the Deceptive Trade Practices Act, which has a 2-year statute of limitations from the time that you knew or should have known of the issue. The fallback position, if we miss the 2-year, is fraud. And fraud carries a 4-year statute of limitations, but it also has the discovery rule. So you might not discover the fraud for 5 or 6 years, in which case you can still bring your fraud claim. So it can be pretty long. The builder's lobby, which is the strongest lobby in Texas, you'll not be surprised to know that, has come up with what they call a statute of repose, which says regardless of any discovery rule or anything else, if 10 years has passed since I built this home, I'm scot-free. So the real estate lobby has not come up with a similar statute.
If the seller doesn't know, he didn't know. It was just there over time. Does that mean the seller's scot-free on that?
Yes and no. I'll give you an example. We're going to start getting into examples. I had a 94-year-old lady that was in a wheelchair. She had not lived in her home for 3 years. The kids are like, Mom, why are we sitting on this house? It's just, disintegrating. Let's sell it. She's like, okay. They list it, they sell it. And on the seller's disclosure notice, I mean, she marked everything according to her knowledge. So the buyers get it inspected, they don't find anything, they buy it. Now they're in the kitchen, they're doing a remodel, and they're pulling the wallpaper off the wall, and the sheetrock comes off in their hands, and there's tons of termites behind the wall. So my client gets sued. Why'd she get sued? She just answered according to her knowledge, right? Well, because you can. You can sue anybody just because they walked on the wrong side of the road. So that's why we tell people to over-disclose, even if you think it's stupid. Another example, had a client that got sued for fraud for failing to disclose flooding on the property, which is one of the questions in the standard seller disclosure notice. And, when I'm getting into the facts of the case, I find out that the garage floods all the time. And I'm like, well, I'm trying to help me out here. Why did you mark no on the seller's disclosure notice? Well, because it never got in the house. Disclosure, probably the most egregious case in my mind, or stupidest case, depending on your viewpoint. I had a client that bought a house. The seller's disclosure notice said it had a brand new hot water heater. The buyers buy it, obviously. They go on vacation, they come back, the water's been running full blast for 7 days.
Oh my God.
Massive damage to the structure, all their belongings. It was not a brand new hot water heater. It was a brand new hot water heater element.
Oh.
So one word was left off that seller's disclosure notice. Now, under the Deceptive Trade Practices Act, that is a clear-cut case. It's a misrepresentation. It's in writing. It was relied upon prior to purchase. And the buyers in those cases are able to get their actual damages plus their attorney fee. Now, I had another case, which we'll get into in a minute, where the failure to disclose was intentional. And if that failure, if you can prove that they did it with intent, then not only do you get your actual damages, but those can be tripled. And that is the second biggest judgment that I've ever obtained in my career. So let's get into those facts. Buyer had hired a buyer's agent. They look at 100 houses. The buyer also goes out on the weekends looking at properties. They find a property on their own. They call their agent. They say, hey, we found the property. We want you to put an offer in and get us a showing, quickly. So they arranged a showing. It took like a week for some reason to get the showing. We found out later why. So they show up at the front door and put a nice Lady answers the door of the owner of the house. The owner welcomes them in and then gives them a couple of things. The first thing they give them is a one-page memorandum, and it literally says memorandum at the top. And it says, "Dear prospective home buyer, we actually contracted to have this home built. Shortly after it was built, we noticed a slight cupping of the foundation. In order to make sure that you would never have an issue with this foundation, we had it examined by a professional engineer. The engineer suggested that we use the best metal piers available in the industry. We did. The engineer oversaw the repairs and has assured us that the home is safe and structurally sound and that you'll never have another problem with the home."
Never.
Sounds pretty good, right? So, the other thing they're giving is a copy of a pier contract, basically from a foundation company, showing where they put 14 piers under this property for $14,000. And this was about 20 years ago. So my clients end up buying the house. It moves like a freight train. They come to see me about 2 years and 4 months after they bought the house, which immediately sent me into a cold sweat because of the statute of limitations problem. Luckily, those clients had went out and hired an engineer to look at their house, and the engineer says there's nothing wrong with your house. If it hadn't been for that, we would have lost that case. But I was able to successfully argue to the court that if my clients who are accountants, they're accountants, they're not builders or engineers, and we have an engineer telling them nothing's wrong, how can you fault my clients on that? So the judge bought that. Anyway, so I sued the sellers. The sellers were husband and wife couple. By the time of the lawsuit, the husband and wife had divorced. Why is that a problem? Well, because now instead of fighting one lawyer, you're fighting two. And I send out discovery. In any litigation, you send out requests for production of documents. And they're supposed to give you all the documents that they have on the situation. So I get I'll call her the ex-wife, I get her responses. And it's a stack about this thick. There's no single document in there that I haven't seen before. Absolutely no help. It was a waste of time. The next day, I get the ex-husband's responses. And I opened this up, it's a stack about this thick. And I literally thought somebody was playing a joke on me because the very first document, and I'm sure there was a reason that it was the very first document in the stack, was a copy of the lawsuit where the sellers had sued their engineer. And in that lawsuit, they claim that the house cannot be repaired, that it has to be torn down and rebuilt from the ground up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I immediately thought about the seller's disclosure notice. I thought, I've read this, and I don't think they disclosed this lawsuit. And if you look at 5008, and then it's number 9, and one of the things that you're supposed to disclose is any lawsuits directly or indirectly affecting the property. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean any pending lawsuit? Well, this is another artful or inartful drafting of a statute, which I'll talk to Richard Hayes about someday. The seller's lawyers argued that meant pending. And this lawsuit had been settled prior to the time that they listed the property for sale. But here's the problem. 5008 is the minimum statutory required disclosure. Some brokerages, and some, I'm not going to name names, but you can imagine some of the bigger brokerages disclose more than is required in their seller's disclosure notices that they type up and that all their clients use. And in this case, luckily for me, this disclosure was one of the heightened disclosures, and it asked the question, are you aware of any pending or prior lawsuits concerning or affecting the property? they still mark no. Now, I'll put to you, it wouldn't matter really, because under the Deceptive Trade Practices Act, one of the items is if you know of information that you fail to disclose to the buyer with the intention that are inducing that buyer into a contract, which they would not have entered into had they known the information, then that's a violation of the DDPA, regardless of what you put in your seller's disclosure notice. So anyway, the reason that it took 7 days to get the first showing was that they were painting that house on the inside. And when we got the invoices for the paint from the ex-husband, they were painting that house about every 3 weeks, because that's how much it was moving. Now, why was the ex-husband so volunteering with all this information?
The wife got the house.
The wife got the house.
Go Christie.
The wife got the house, he gave me the case. Now, we sued her, obviously. I turned the husband loose with a big handshake and a thank you. We get to trial. My expert had claimed that it would cost $147,000 to bring that house as close as possible to pre-design failure status. Notice I did not say fix. Every engineer I've talked to says you can't fix one of these, period. So keep that in mind. The judgment that day was over $600,000. And anybody want to guess what the ex-wife did for a living?
Real estate.
Real estate agent.
Oh.
She listed it under, she was not the broker, but she listed it under her employer's brokerage. So who pays the judgment? The broker. So what's the motto of all this? Disclose, 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 disclose.
Hey, Don, can I ask you though, how much are we supposed to really help our sellers when they're filling out that seller's disclosure?
You know, you have a fiduciary duty to your client, so you're not supposed to help them. It's their disclosure. Now, I'll give you another, I'm sorry, I got to throw this out here. I've had cases where the smoking gun was, and listen to this closely, the seller's disclosure notice that the seller had received when they purchased the home. So why am I telling you this? Tell your agents if you have a seller that's fixing to fill out a seller's disclosure notice, to go find the seller's disclosure notice that they received when they purchased the house. There will be something on there that they just flat forgot about. And if they don't disclose it in their disclosure, we again have a black and white misrepresentation. So you have a duty to tell them to, hey, disclose, over-disclose. Disclose it again. It's not stupid. Disclose it. Please disclose it. Thank you very much. And then if you get the disclosure and you notice from your review of the property that they're not being accurate, I think you've got to tell them, you know, you didn't disclose this or that, and you're going to get hammered someday. So, yes?
No, I'm a newbie, but my pet peeve that I've noticed a lot is, I've seen it frequently and I'm new, is the question that says, have you received insurance funds and not made the repairs? I can't tell you how many times I've seen yes marked, and I think it's just the clients are not reading the whole question and agents aren't catching it. Like it gets uploaded and I'm like texting the agent going, is this accurate? Like, are they saying they received proceeds that didn't do the work on? Oh no, that's a mistake. So I just don't know how much some agents are even reading what the client put on there, honestly.
We had a case not too long ago, which I thought was just really interesting. The client ended up running from the property after talking to us. But they contacted the listing agent. They were going to, put in an offer. They want to know if they had any inspection reports. The agent says, well, we happened to have one that was done by another buyer, and we ended up with it. But my client won't let you look at it.
You can't do that, because if you have them from 4 years back, you have to hand them over, right?
I mean, that's one of the items on most sellers is photos.
But now you have that whole copyright thing on the freaking sellers, or the inspections. Like, it's for you and you only, so if you hand it off to anybody else, then it's a moot
Well,
point.
since it's for me and me only, I can just say, I don't know about anything that's in there.
Well, no, but I'm saying you hand it off or whatever, and then freaking,
Yeah.
you contact that inspector, and that inspector won't answer the questions for you because it was for you, not for, you handed
Yeah,
it
and
to
that's
me.
within their rights, that's within their rights to do, is to not talk to
Okay,
the inspector themselves, because they did the work for this other person.
right, okay.
And for that matter, when you're representing the buyer, you need to be telling that buyer, hey, even if you get to see this inspection report, you can't rely on it,
Right,
because it wasn't done for you.
right.
So there's no privity of contract there. So if that inspection report turns out to be wrong, you can't sue that inspector because you didn't have a relationship with that inspector.
Well, here's the case, what we had is we had somebody that, they had that previous inspection because the house had only been bought back a year ago, back when we were buying houses for $100,000 more expensive. And then we had an inspection and there was some discrepancies in what this guy had and this guy had. So they tried to call this guy to see, you know, hey, well, this inspector's saying this, but you're showing that they're not showing it. And there was no record of it ever being fixed prior, for what was in this year. There was no record of it being fixed, but it was not a problem for this inspector, but this inspector found it.
Right.
So they were just trying to link stuff together, and that inspector just said, well, I can't talk to you, so I don't know what you're talking about.
Janie?
So I thought when a buyer one gets an inspection, doesn't buy it, gives it their inspection to buyer two, I thought buyer one had to give their, okay, their permission for buyer two to use or disclose anything in there. That's not the case. Once buyer two gets it, it's theirs to,
You mean seller?
no, buyer one gets a home inspection, doesn't buy the house.
But somehow the
Oh,
seller.
yeah, the seller's got it.
Yeah.
I don't know how buyer two gets the inspection, but they get the, so buyer one doesn't have to give permission, here, you can use my inspection.
Well, by virtue of the fact that the seller had it,
Uh,
that's where that problem arose.
And
And
it-
then I think it was further impacted by the fact that, and I don't know that I can blame the seller's agent, but the seller's agent went ahead and told them that they had it. But we can't let you look at it.
And it's still the case that if a buyer sends the listing agent an inspection, whether you open the email or not, you're responsible and liable for it being in your inbox and everything
Yeah.
that's in that inspection.
Here's the problem. You as the agent, your buyer, your seller, or buyer for that matter, knows everything that you know. I don't know if you were aware of that or not. If you know it, they know it. Even if you didn't tell them, that's just the law. So the problem arises is if it arrives in your inbox and they prove it was in your inbox, how are you gonna prove you didn't look at it? And I have seen some people say, if you get an inspection, do not send that to me.
Right.
Yeah,
I see that.
I can't see anything wrong with that, frankly. That's probably what I would tell them, don't send that.
I never let them send it.
Do what?
I never let them send it.
I don't either. I say, please don't.
Just-
send it.
Oh, but there are times when they will send it no matter what. I mean, they'll just send it as the seller's agent, they'll, you know, Lisa as the buyer's agent, she just sends it to me because
I
she
don't know what
wants
she's
the
doing.
seller to fix whatever. No, I mean, I'm
Let's
just
just
saying,
say.
like, but I never asked for it. Like, you should just tell me what you would like me to ask the seller to fix, and that's it. And maybe give me a one-siding page of the report, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Exactly what I tell them to do. I don't wanna, don't send me the full report.
But you do still see, you know, buyer's agents that are out there that will send the entire report. And I don't quite know what you do about that, because I'm with Jamie on this, that
Then you have to
just,
update the seller's disclosures,
and that
that's what
just
you do with
it
it.
does get all over me, but at that point, is it too late?
Yes.
To Don's point,
You
like,
can't put the
what's
ding
yelling
back
at
on.
them gonna do for the situation?
Don, do you think there's any problem if there is an inspection report like that? I've always wondered that if the seller couldn't have known what was on that, because like it got done, the inspection got done, now the information's available, that the seller didn't want to see it, is there any chance that is a problem? That they said, I don't want to see that inspection report, but they could know what was on there if they received it? Do you think there's any
If
responsibility?
I understand your question, I don't think that's an issue.
Okay.
Now, set the inspection report aside, let's say it has all kinds of, let's say it says evidence of prior flooding on the property, just be easy. And let's say that we can prove that we never saw that report. But when the lawsuit comes, if we prove that the seller knew there was flooding on the property, it doesn't matter what that inspection report said.
I see all kinds of problems with that, say, you know, Lisa sends it to me. Well, I'm not very techie and I never see that.
The problem really is,
I don't see it, my computer crashed, any number of things. What's your,
He said, she said.
Yeah, that's what comes down to what we call a question of fact.
it's usually not with the inspector, the major issues, it's all the cosmetics that they find, that you'd have to go back and redo the cellars. I mean, there's so much little crack here and I always find that to be the problem. That's not what they want fixed, so don't send me 18 things that the seller, or that the inspection shows. That's really not a major to the issues.
By the way, I know, I just had another case pop in my brain. Buyer buys the home knowing it has prior foundation repairs. They have a major foundation company come out to look at it. And before they buy it, they say it's okay. As a matter of fact, it's the same company that put piers under it. They live in the house about 4 years. I'll say in about year 2, they have the same foundation company come out again. They're just, want to make sure the house is okay. Foundation company says you need 14 more piers. So they get a second opinion. The second opinion says you don't need any piers. So 2 more years go by, they decide to sell. They tell their agent all this, the agent, and as they're filling out the seller's photo, because you're asking what do you do? The agent tells them to not mark that they're aware of any issues with the foundation. And there's a pending lawsuit. I don't know why owners ever do that. I mean, the argument is that that second opinion that said you don't need piers, that's what the agent would like.
I mean, at that point, when you say, why don't you get an engineer's report, and then let's, I mean, maybe address it from there, like, because you
I would
guys
say
have 2
disclose.
companies say
You've
different
got-
things.
You've got differing information, so just say yes. How's that? You can't get in trouble for saying, yeah, I've got a problem. It's only when you say, no, I don't have a problem, but you're going to run into a problem.
Yeah, but the problem there is, I mean, he's in the business of doing foundation repair. So he's saying, you need 14 piers. Another guy comes along that's more honest and says, no, you really don't. This is just a guy trying to get, I mean, I've had this situation. And so you say, yes, you just put a stigma on the house.
But that's why an engineer's report should give you the true,
Well,
what
that's
is
what
ever is
You'd have to go
needed.
back and get an
So
engineer.
who's that engineer's report done for?
The seller.
The seller. So now you've got one report saying you need 14 piers, you've got another person saying no piers. You've got an engineer's report saying you're okay. You still gonna mark no on the seller's photo?
I would just disclose all 3 of those things, and then let them make a decision on the buyer on what they want to do. But I would certainly lean more towards the engineer's report than the 2 foundation companies that came out.
Same issue with roofs.
Yeah.
And by the way, on roofs, you can tell there's a coat on the back of the shingle. they'll let you know how old that roof really is. I've had 2 of those cases where they disclosed an age, but they said the roof was a lot younger than it really was.
There's a code?
I didn't know there was a
I
code
didn't
on
know
that.
there was a code.
That's new. Bring that out.
Now we have to take.
Now we're going to deal with the
So
shingles.
we can pull the shingles.
Who's got shingles? We're coming to your house. We're coming to your house, Dawn.
My house doesn't have asphalt in it.
So who's the equivalent of an engineer for a roof?
You know, all I can tell you is the insurance, here's how it comes up. You have a L claim after you bought the house. You bought the house, been there a month, you have a L claim. The insurance adjuster comes out there and says, well, your roof's 20 years old. We're not in the business of rehab. We're in the business of hazards, and there's no hazard here because your roof's fully depreciated. And the seller's photo notice said the roof is 7 years old. So, who's the equivalent, you know, roofers, good roofers can tell you generally. The other problem on that subject, I had a lawsuit where the disclosure notice was filled out properly. There was no hell issue. They enter into the contract to sell, and then literally a week before closing, the big hailstorm comes through. And the seller doesn't bother telling anybody. The buyer buys the house not knowing there's a potential issue. A week later, he notices everybody's, all these roofing trucks in the neighborhood, and he goes out to get his newspaper, and the neighbor says, are you getting the new roof too? No, what are you talking about? And he found out about the issue. Now, that was a bad deal because, you know, normally your seller's insurance would have covered that. But at the time that this issue is actually discovered and reported, the seller no longer has an insurable interest in the property. So the insurance company says, yeah, thanks a lot, but we're not, we don't know any money. They sure don't owe the buyer anything, because there's no, the insurance contract is with the seller. There was a lawsuit on that one, and luckily I was able to get the seller's insurance to only it could have been really bad.
Where was the seller's agent? Like, why wouldn't they make a note of that?
They claim they
When the
didn't
storm
know.
came through? They what?
They claim they didn't know.
Well, that's.
They just didn't want to
that
pay their
happens.
deductible.
Yeah, you'll have hail on one side of town, and
Yeah.
on the other side, didn't have any damage at all. Didn't even have any. So that, we've had that happen.
Kind of on the buyer's
It's the
agent
buyer's
too, to do
agent.
your due diligence.
Yeah, you know.
Well, and thank you for bringing that up. So the way that I advise people to solve this problem is, you know, you have your inspection, like everybody has their inspection. And then right before closing, have the inspector run back out there just one last time to look at the roof again. About all you can do.
That was the seller's responsibility, you know, to inform
I
the
feel
seller's
so.
agent and to disclose that to the buyers. It could have been an easy fix.
That's a good question. Is he responsible, is the seller responsible for updating the seller disclosure at the point that you're almost ready to close?
There's no statutory requirement for them to change the disclosure that gets handed. But remember, the DTVA, he had information that he failed to disclose. And the buyer buys in reliance upon an old seller's disclosure notice, right? So there is a duty, it's just not statutory duty, it's a common law duty to update any disclosures. If information has changed in that prior disclosure, yes, you want to update it. Again, you can't get in trouble for over disclosing.
Okay, you good, Dawn? Are we good? Can we
I
move
think we're
on?
good.
Any other que, I know,
More.
we could, we really could listen to it for a long time.